Hello and welcome to everybody who has joined into listening into this talk. My name is Pankaj Sekhsaria. I teach at IIT-Bombay at the Center for Technology Alternatives for Rural Areas. And I'm going to be presenting today some of my new work in the field of science and technology studies that I actually did recently as part of my PhD work at Maastricht University. In particular, there are two books that have been published recently, and these are the books that I'm going to be talking about. But before I go there, let me also thank the Indian International Center for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity of speaking on this work and on the books that I have done that I'll just come to very soon. So here we are. The title of my presentation, which is based on my most recent book of a very similar title, is titled Even at the Nanoscale: Society's Deep Impact on Science, Technology and Innovation in India. This, as I mentioned in the very beginning, comes from the field of science and technology studies, which some of you are probably aware is quite a well-established field now in the Western academy, but is something that is just about picking up in the Indian context, and where one is using tools in history, sociology, anthropology to study the science and technology enterprise, the various components of the enterprise, including laboratories, policy processes, institutional processes, etc. I had this opportunity of doing a PhD from Maastricht University in the Netherlands, where I was a part of a project looking at nanoscience and nanotechnology. And I had a PhD project that was looking at innovation and what we called the cultures of innovation within the scientific practice. I'll come to some of those details in a bit, but I just want to go back to about 50 years in the past, at a time when a very iconic book was published on which a lot of my work is based, and a lot of it kind of set off a field of studying the scientific laboratory. The book that I'm talking about is Laboratory Life by Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar. Laboratory Life, The Construction of Scientific Facts. It is a book, as you will see on the left-hand side in the text, that is based on field work done by Bruno Latour in Roger Guillemot's laboratory at the Salk Institute. And it provides an important link between the sociology of modern sciences and laboratory studies in the history of science. There is a little quote from the book that I'll read out to set the context of what this book did and the methodological dimensions which were very important to understand how this kind of work has panned out. And this is what the book says. Since the turn of the century, scores of men and women have penetrated deep forests, lived in hostile climates, and weathered hostility, boredom, and disease in order to gather the remnants of so-called primitive societies. By contrast to the frequency of these anthropological excursions, relatively few attempts have been made to penetrate the intimacy of life among tribes which are much nearer at hand. This is perhaps surprising in view of the reception and importance attached to their product in modern civilized societies. We refer, of course, to tribes of scientists and to their production of science. So this was a very interesting and very innovative turning around of the lens, and in some senses putting the scientist and the laboratory and the scientific processes under what we might call sociological and anthropological lenses of study. The other analogy that is used very often and now has been also questioned in some ways is the idea of the black box. To look at a laboratory as a black box and to enter that black box where the heart of the modern scientific enterprise lies, and what happens when scientific knowledge and scientific truths are created. So this is a journey into those laboratories to understand what happens inside. So of course, this was quite innovative for those times, and there was an interesting reception that happened, and this is what Jonas Salk himself says in the introduction to the book. And this is available, but I will just try and look at the third paragraph where he talks about Bruno Latour. He has tried to observe scientists with the same cold and unblinking eye with which cells or hormones or chemical reactions are studied, of course, by scientists, a process which may evoke, and he's talking here about the process which the anthropologist or the sociologist follows inside the laboratory, a process which may evoke an uneasy feeling on part of the scientists who are unaccustomed to having themselves analyzed from such a vantage point. This kind of objective observation by an outsider of scientists at work, as if they were a colony of ants or of rats in a maze, could be unbearable. Bruno Latour, a philosopher sociologist, began a sociological study of biology, and along the way came to see sociology biologically. His own style of thought was transformed by our concepts and ways of thinking about organisms, order, information, mutations, etc. So what he's saying in a very interesting way is that the STSer, the person who's actually studying, the sociologist, the anthropologist who's studying the scientific community, is himself or herself also influenced, and a change happens. So there is a kind of a dialogue and a process that is iterative, where both sides are influenced in some ways. And this is these are the kind of very interesting experiences one does have when one enters a laboratory, not as a scientist, but coming along with different glasses or different lenses to look at what is happening inside the laboratory. So this, in very briefly and in a very limited context, is the background of the work that I'm going to be presenting today. So the whole field of laboratory studies started off with this work in the late 70s, early 80s, and it has expanded quite a bit, and many other dimensions have been added onto it. One might say that in the Indian context, it has not been very popular, it has not been very widespread, and there are all kinds of challenges, but there are interesting things beginning to happen in India as well, and some very interesting studies have started to come out. I will locate my work very specifically, what I'm going to present here in this slide. It is, like I mentioned, in the field of science and technology studies. It is in some ways trying to enter the black box of the laboratory. I had very specific questions related to innovation, so I also draw on innovation studies literature, and I'll present some of that. It is studying science and the scientist. It is studying technology and the technologist with sociological and anthropological lenses, like I mentioned in the last point. So this is the kind of methodological background and framework within which this work is going to be located. Also, some very specific points on locating my work and the presentation that I'm going to make. It is of the mainstream of India science and technology establishment. As part of my PhD work, I studied 5 laboratories across 3 cities in India that do cutting edge nanoscience and nanotechnology work. And why that's important to mention is because some of the things that I eventually say in my PhD and these books that I'm discussing, we tend to associate with the peripheries, with the marginals, not certainly with the central core of the Indian science and technology establishment. So I just want to underline that this work is very much about what contemporary modern science and technology also is. This is largely qualitative work, deeply engaged case studies, qualitative interviewing, historical analysis, and lab ethnographies in the lab studies kind of tradition. I spent a large amount of time in my 5 years of PhD work in these 5 laboratories in the 3 cities I mentioned, Pune, Chennai, and Hyderabad. Just trying to see what scientists were doing, chatting with them, understanding their world and their work. What was very interesting that one saw emerging in a very maybe unexpected but also not so unexpected way is the idea of diversity. From spending these 4 years, 5 years in these laboratories, one saw the emergence of a diversity of sources, resources, people, ideas, materials, instruments, and knowledge systems that are actually at play in the Indian laboratory, even in a field of this modern nanoscience and nanotechnology. Not that each of these was visible in each of the laboratories, but as a combination in different ways, one very clearly saw that there was a whole set of very interesting things that was happening. And I do go on to make a kind of a normative claim in some senses, again in my PhD and these books, is that these diversities is an asset. And it might be a very straightforward and easy thing to say, but how can this be made an asset and how can it be mobilized in the context of science and technology in the Indian establishment, in the Indian context, I think is something that we need to be thinking about. And then I talk of an enculturing of innovation or an innovation that is already encultured. And by this, to put it simply, is to make a case that work even in the in the heart of modern science and technology, in an emerging cutting edge field like nanoscience, is deeply influenced by the socio-political, cultural, economic context in which the laboratory is located. And this, one may argue, is one of the central themes and the central takeaways of the STS kind of work, where it locates existing, modern or any kind of scientific work within the context of its location. And the fact that the idea that of universality, of placelessness, which is quite central to the scientific idea, one sees that it doesn't work that way, because where you are, who you are with, and things like that do seem to have an impact on science, research, and innovation, even in the modern laboratory. So this is a quick overview of the empirical work that I did and that these books are based on. You can see the first column, and I will fill them up one by one. There is the specific laboratory I speak about. There's a social context, because as I just mentioned, the social context matters even in scientific research. And what I did in my research, eventually in writing it up, was to kind of link up each of the lessons and the stories from the laboratories to 4 different, very prominent dimensions of contemporary Indian society, social context of contemporary Indian society, and I will come to that, to make the case that, and to show how in different places, in different contexts, how what is outside the laboratory has a very significant influence on what is inside the laboratory. There's a scale at which innovation happens. This is the 3rd row, which I won't go into great detail. And again, I won't go into great detail, but I've tried to put out a kind of conceptual frame within which we can locate these particular studies of these particular laboratories. So the social context, each of these 4 laboratories, as I just mentioned, and the work happening there in the particular cases that I study, in some senses can be seen to be talking to certain realities of Indian society. In the first case, resource constraint, and one is talking here of material and financial resources, also in some ways qualified and trained human resource. And this, we all know, is a very prominent reality of the Indian context. The second case study, which I won't talk about in much great detail, is about a context, a national and a social context, in which large number of traditional practices and knowledge systems still continue to exist even today, side by side, in parallel with modern science and technology. The specific case here would be of Ayurveda, which is extremely prevalent, we all know, and also the fact that it continues in parallel with modern biomedicine. And what happens when an Ayurveda practitioner, an Ayurveda researcher, or the Ayurveda practice enters a modern nanobiotechnology laboratory? What are the kinds of conversations that can happen? Why does this even happen in the first place? And some very interesting conversations happen when these 2 different worldviews meet in a particular space in a modern laboratory. So the underlying factor here being that we are a country and we are a society where multiple knowledge practices and multiple knowledge systems exist. And it throws up very interesting possibilities, not just of conversations, but perhaps also innovations and products outside. The third case study is a very specific case study of a laboratory in Hyderabad. And the social exigency that one is talking about is that of water. Of such a large country, so many years after independence, a large portion of our country still does not have access to clean drinking water, which is a basic human need and a human right, as it were. And we are all aware of this reality. And how does this reality then influence the scientific process or the scientific laboratory or the scientists as they're working? And how does that kind of play out? So this is that one case study that I will be talking about. And the last one is patriarchy. We all know this, how in a country like ours, where the girl child and continues to be extremely marginalized, and right from the time there's a baby in the womb to when she's an infant, how there are various structures of our society that are extremely oppressive and sometimes very violently so. And then there is this case study here of 2 eye hospitals and research centers that are forced in some senses to respond in their clinical practice and their scientific research, with the center being that of the marginalized girl child. The first case study is of the scanning tunneling microscope in the University of Pune. This is innovation at the micro level. This is a case study I will go into some detail. So it is about instrument making in a small laboratory in Pune University in the Department of Physics. The second case is about also in Pune in the Agarkar Research Institute in the Center for Nanobioscience, where, like I just mentioned a short while ago, Ayurveda practitioner and the Ayurveda practices, particularly of the Rasha Shastra tradition, the Bhasmas, they came into the laboratory because there was some attempt to understand how the Bhasmas perhaps work, where the operating principle is at the nanoscale. And what happens when these people come in, and what are the conflicts and the challenges that these two different worldviews have to face. And it made for some very, very interesting conversations. And I won't have time to discuss that today, but nevertheless. The third case study is of ARCI, a DST institution in Hyderabad, where they tried to develop a low-cost water filter using nano silver that is easy to use and that is very effective. And it is a response to the fact that this is the reality, such a big one in India where we don't have water. And users matter. If you see the last row, it's a very interesting case because in spite of some very innovative scientific work in the laboratory and even as an entrepreneurship involved, it is a water filter that does not take off in the market. It does not gain acceptance. So we don't know what the reasons might be, but I think it's an interesting study, an interesting case to understand what does success mean in the context of science and technology innovation, and also in terms of entrepreneurship. And lastly, is a case study from two of India's most prominent eye hospitals and research centers, the L.V. Prasad Eye Institute in Hyderabad and Shankar Netralaya in Chennai. This is the case study that I will discuss in some detail about the condition of retinoblastoma, malignant tumor of the eye of little children, and how the status of the girl child actually influences and her social context influences the scientist and the clinician in some ways, unexpected ways that we may not expect a scientist or a clinician to be affected. And here, as you will see again in the last row, is it actually seems to, from the analyst perspective, from my perspective, reconfigure the subjectivities of the scientist. And I talk about a scientist clinician becoming a kind of trio, an individual becoming a scientist, clinician, social activist, because the reality that this person is experiencing or is facing up forces the person to bring in these dimensions which one may have otherwise not kind of considered. So I will go to the first case study and just a couple of lines here to synthesize what the story is. So scrapped computers, Juna Bazaar. So Juna Bazaar, of course, in Hindi is, or Marathi is, the scrap market or the old markets. Scrap computers, Juna Bazaar, a cutting edge STM, well within my radar. So this is the story of the STM, like I mentioned, and these two arrows are pointing out to the fact that I'm going to be talking in greater detail about these two cases. And before I go ahead, this case study has also been published now. The story of this one particular laboratory of instrument making was published a little while ago in this book called Instrumental Lives. And as the subtitle indicates, it's an intimate biography of an Indian laboratory. So I go into great detail of what happened in this particular laboratory, and I will share some of those details here. So to a very quick snapshot account of the history of this particular case, the STM is a scanning tunneling microscope. And this laboratory in Pune University, starting with the 80s, late 80s, started to make scanning tunneling microscopes in very interesting ways in-house, indigenously, in the small laboratory in Pune. The history of the STM is a very interesting one. This is a model of one of the earliest scanning tunneling microscopes that was built at IBM in Zurich in late 1980s. The STM is a particularly important instrument because it was the instrument that is, or it is the instrument that is credited with having spawned nanoscience and nanotechnology. Nanoscience uh, is the study of matter, very broadly speaking, at the nanoscale, which is 10 raised to minus 9 meters. Just to give it a comparison, human hair is about 20,000, 30,000 nanometers thick. So we're really talking of a very, very small scale at which this operates. And the scanning tunneling microscope developed by IBM in Zurich was awarded the Physics Nobel Prize for 1986. One half of the Nobel Prize of 1986 was awarded to the STM. And it really set off an entire field because it allowed one to map and to visualize at the nanoscale. It's a non-optical microscope, a little bit like a dot matrix printer, with a very fine tip that is then scanned across a surface, and the process known as tunneling, where an electron jumps because of the voltage difference, is then mapped, and this is used to create a surface profile which can then be seen at the nanoscale. Now, what is very interesting is that in our story of this university lab of this person called C.V. Dharmadhikari, Professor C.V. Dharmadhikari, who headed this small lab in the university, in the late 80s, through a whole series of very fortunate circumstances, he came across this development of the STM in Europe and in the US. And he started to actually make these instruments with his students in his lab in Pune around that very same time, and very successfully, and in ways that are actually very, very interesting. And because of the paucity of time, I won't go into all the details of this thing, but give you some instances of what one means when one says that one is doing it in a very interesting kind of manner. So one of the first things that I saw when I first entered the laboratory almost 10 years ago now, and was this refrigerator that was there in the lab and this tripod set up inside. And what I was told and what I learned is that the refrigerator is not here to cool the instrument as one would imagine the a refrigerator to be performing the work. But here, with the compressor taken out, because the instrument is a very sensitive one, the refrigerator case is used actually just as a vibration and sound isolating device. So it was clearly a manifestation of the fact that this was a laboratory with limited resources, and it would not have been possible for them to buy anything that was more expensive as vibration isolation. And here was this available box of a refrigerator that the professor's student had left behind, and it became a very nice opportunity for to be converted into something that could then be used in the laboratory. Now, there are many, many cases of this kind that I saw being constantly repeated in this lab, which kind of struck a chord with me in the sense of understanding why it was happening. I'll give you a couple more examples and then move on in some senses. Here is another example of innovating for a, again, vibration isolation. You can see a scanning tunneling microscope right on the top, and on the table you see the inflated tube of a car tire, and you see thick metal plates on which are on the tube, and then there are a number of about 6 or 7 thinner thick plates that are each one also separated by a thin rubber tubing on which finally you can see that the instrument is based. So what's being done here is that multiple layers of vibration isolation also are being created at a very low cost. Here is another example, a picture from the cover of Current Science. This was a story on this lab that the history of this lab and the work of this lab that was published in the Current Science in May 2013. And the image here is a very interesting one, and you can see the scale. It's really tiny. The tuning fork you see here, like in the case of the earlier photos I showed you, is kind of scavenged from waste. It has been bought from a second-hand quartz watch or a watch dealer. It's from a quartz watch. You have these tuning forks inside, and you see a fine tip pasted on top of one of the arms of the tuning fork. And this has been converted into, this is the part of the setup of a joint AFM, which is an atomic force microscope and a scanning tunneling microscope system. Now what is interesting here is that this was all done at low cost with material that has been scraped, so-called, from waste. This, in fact, was the work done by the last student in this particular laboratory. So what we see here, And what I call, and I will show later to you, is a kind of reconfiguring of materiality for using materials in ways that they were not meant for, and they were not created for that particular thing. They were created for something else, and they are now being used in a particular way, driven among many things, and importantly by the whole issue of resource constraint. Because here, a laboratory, even in a prominent institution, presumably does not have the kind of resources that you might need to, which generally are assumed are available and are needed for research to be done. What has been done here is with a combination of innovation, creativity, and an awareness of what is around. You're using materials and resources to do the work that you want to do. And one will see that in this particular case, it was not just materials, but there was a certain openness, there was a certain acknowledgement and a certain mobilization of human and material resources, like from the Chor Bazaar of Pune, or like from other smaller institutions that were willing to collaborate, that made this enterprise happen. And it was very high tech, it was extremely high quality, if one might use that term here. Now, one of the key questions asked, like I just mentioned earlier, is that can you really do good science with this, and how is it that good science can be delivered with this? And one sees in terms of what was delivered, and that could perhaps be the logic and the argument. If we look at what this particular laboratory did over the 25 years of its existence, and I'm really having to cut the story short here, is the professor and his students published research in areas of, in the modern and frontier areas of modern science. The work was published in leading peer-reviewed scientific journals. Many of the PhD students who came out from this laboratory, working with this material, constructing their instruments, were then immediately picked up as postdocs in the world's leading labs. And what's a very important part one realized was training in instrument building as an important part of university education. What was very interesting in terms of the response to this work, because over the last few years now that I've been talking about it and presenting it, one of the questions that kept coming up in the beginning and keeps coming up now is, if such good instruments and delivering high quality work were being developed, then why wasn't it commercialized? Why didn't it go out into the market and make money for the laboratory, the university, and the scientists? And I found it very striking that this seemed to be the unanimous question that was being asked, to the complete neglect of everything else that may have been possible or was done in this particular laboratory. And this is a very important question about innovation that comes in, because everything today, even in the scientific enterprise, is being evaluated from certain lenses. For example, of economics, of viability, of patenting, of commercialization, which, while important, cannot or should not necessarily be the only question that we're asking. Because if one looks at the experiences worldwide, and there is a lot of material now available in literature, both scientists and science policy makers in India and globally are writing about some kind of a crisis where resources, financial resources, and instrumentation of the highest quality of the maximum cost is available in laboratories and institutions, but there is not good enough human resource to do justice to the particular instrumental infrastructure that is there. So the question is that what do we do with these instruments and this equipment if we don't have well-trained human resource to actually be dealing with it? And this is, in some senses, a very central output and contribution of this kind of laboratory work that is happening. And I spoke to some of the students who came out of the laboratory in this particular case, and the confidence with which they work with instruments, the confidence with which they talk about instruments is quite amazing, because they are saying that they're not scared of instrumentation. They're not scared of expensive, sophisticated equipment, because when they were doing their PhDs, they have themselves worked with that material. They have pulled apart instruments, put them together. They know how to deal with the instrument. Like one of them said, the instrument does not push us, we push the instrument. So the questions that are asked of this kind of scientific work, of this kind of laboratory work, I think need to be looked at in a much larger context. And that's where the innovation literature and innovation questions become important, because the idea of innovation has become has continues to be very, very centered on what one might consider very Schumpeterian ideas of the entrepreneur, of the firm, of success in the market, of making money, etc. And it doesn't do justice, among other many other things, to a lot of the scientific work that is happening. Now, because I mentioned my work was on innovation, I go ahead in my thesis and otherwise, and I'm working on this. I'm proposing a kind of culture of innovation that exists across the spectrum in the Indian context. And this is very initial work, and it's open for testing, for challenging, for refutation. There's 8 characteristics. There are certainly, I'm not sure if they are necessary, but or if they're sufficient, but whether they're necessary, and all of this needs to be looked at. But when one looks at the work, for example, in this laboratory and from extended literature, in the context that we are, one can argue for a culture of innovation that has these 8 characteristics. And I'll read them out quickly and then leave them to you. You can access them in the books and in other things I've published, and with some more detail and more explanations, and perhaps there might be interesting responses that you might yourself have. So reconfiguring materiality, like I said, using materials not meant for what they were created, bridging ways of knowing and knowledge systems, problem solving, which all innovation is about. It is a kind of innovation that is driven by resource constraint, which, as we just saw, is very central to the Indian experience. There is a very, I think, interesting component which I have not explored fully, and I think offers some very interesting possibilities of a materials and conceptual commons, where the waste, what is discarded as waste, becomes available as a resource for somebody else, or what is available for much cheaper price than would originally be, because it is now a second-hand market, so to say. There, of course, is the idea of the, whether it is really legal. In this context, there may not be a problem, but one can think of many other efforts at creating products and outputs that might be considered illegal, even certainly legally gray or liminal. A very interesting dimension that comes across, I think, is the idea of commercialization. And it appears that prima facie, first up, commercialization per se is not the reason why this innovation happens. Like in the case of this particular laboratory, it is just about getting by, just surviving, that is driving the innovation. It might become commercial eventually, but the idea is not in the first step to make money. It is to get by. It is to just do the minimum things you need to survive, whether in your life or in the laboratory. And the last point is that there's a very deeply entrenched culture of recycling, because of an old history, so to say, because of materials available, because of resource constraint. And I think that has very interesting dimensions and possibilities in today's conversations of climate change and sustainability and things like that. I move on now to the second case, which is that of retinoblastoma in the girl child, like I mentioned. An orphan disease, a tumor in the eye, a one-eyed girl, no, let her die. So the story here, very simply, is of this tumor called retinoblastoma that affects really small children. And very simply put, from what I understood in these 2 institutions I mentioned, the L.V. Prasad Eye Institute and Shankar Netralaya, is that there is a moment when the tumor really goes bad and it leaves the eye, and that's a moment when you really can't save the child and the child is lost. There is an earlier stage when you detect the tumor in time, and with conventional chemotherapy, you can, save the eye and save the child. And there is an intermediate space where the tumor has consumed the eye but not spread to the body. So what the doctors practice is enucleation. Enucleation. Sorry, you take the eye out and you allow the child to live. So the tumor and the eye is taken out, and I'm sorry, there was a power issue. Let me continue. So the point I was making is that what the doctor says, that there is a situation where the eye can be removed and the child is saved. But what the experience of these doctors were in both the places is that, particularly in the case of the girl child, when the doctor explained to the parents of the patient, of the little child, that we'll save your child, but your eye will be removed. The eye of the child will be removed. In a number of cases, they said that the parents did not come back, particularly when it was a girl child, because they didn't want a girl child, because it was a unanimous kind of argument that getting this child married when she was of a marriageable age would be very difficult. And they'd rather let the child die. So it was a kind of a stark reality that in some senses we know is very prominent in the Indian context. And what I saw in these laboratories, because what's also interesting in these two institutions is that the clinicians are also expected to be scientists and researchers. They have to spend time in the laboratory on the bench doing scientific work. So it's a very interesting combination of science, research, and clinical practice. So the institutional mandate had forced a clinician to become a scientist. And when the patient and the social reality of that patient entered the clinic, this scientist clinician also had to become a kind of a social activist, because there were many cases when the doctors I spoke to said that they were forced to cross their kind of boundaries and instruct or almost sermonize to parents by saying things like, it's not right what you're doing with your girl child, and even things that were even more stark in that sense. Now, so there is this reality of society outside that enters the laboratories in unexpected ways. And I will just go into some literature here as an analyst, to just kind of quickly run through and give you a sense of what I got from the whole thing. So in innovation studies and STS, there is a very interesting dimension of how the user is looked at. So while in the conventional understanding, the whole process of innovation is a linear one, from science to technology to product, and then, end of use and obsolescence. The user has always been just somebody who is at the end of the pipeline and not really having much of an impact. But there's a lot of very interesting work, and I'll just give you some examples. Here is Von Hippel's work of user-driven innovation, where he talks about 80% of innovation in scientific work, in scientific instrument making, which applies to our earlier case, is done by the user, in this case, the scientist himself or herself. There is the case of other work where Kovan and others talk about the consumption junction, where the customer makes choices. This was based in the US, looking at the history of home heating systems. Mediation junction, these are all concepts in the theory there. Mediation between production and consumption. There is a social construction of technology, where one is talking about the relevant social groups and how the user and the social construct and how societal structures are constituted influence the development of technology. And then there are other categories within that, for example. And there's a very interesting category and conceptualization, which I find very useful in this particular case, and I used, is that of the non-user by Sally Wyatt and other researchers, where they talk about technology not being used for multiple reasons. The idea that somebody doesn't use technology because they don't know or they don't want is just one dimension of the non-use of technology. And they have 4 categories of the non-user of technology. There is the resistor, there is the rejected or the rejecter, there's the excluded, and there's the expelled. So non-use of technology happens for a whole range of reasons. And for anybody, I think this is a very interesting and useful conceptualization, because if the use of technology, the successful use of technology, or the use of technology has to become successful, the innovator or maybe the entrepreneur has to target the non-user, has to understand why non-use is happening, has to understand why the user is not using technology. And the reasons could be along the spectrum, like has been described here. And it is to identify this reason for non-use in which the success of technology will lie. And if I take this forward to applying this kind of framework in the case of this girl child, one saw as an analyst that the girl child actually becomes an aggregate of these multiple non-users. It is not one entity that we're talking about here. There is the helpless infant who has no voice, who in some senses has been expelled. She can't take a decision about what should be done to her. there is a to be married woman of tomorrow, conceptually. If she lives, she will get married tomorrow. There is the immediate family. Because it is not just the individual who uses the technology or the solution or the cure. It has a deep impact on the family, both in terms of being influenced by what happens to this little girl child, but also influencing the girl child or the fate of the child by the decisions that this family makes. And there was this case, one of the doctors, Shankar Netral, I mentioned, where this girl child was to be treated, had been identified with having retinoblastoma. The parents were supposed to come back for treatment a few months later, and they never came back. And when they did, many months ago, the tumor had gone beyond control, and the doctor was very angry, and he said, "There's no way I can save your child. What is this behavior you people do? Who gave you the right to give birth to a child if you did not take care, etc., etc." And the doctor was telling me the story, and then he said, Pankaj, the parents sat and listened for a long while, and then the father started to speak almost with tears in his eyes, and he said, "I fully agree with you, doctor, and it was absolutely incorrect on my part. But I have a dying mother at home with me. I have a mother with a heart condition, and I'm not in a position to save both. I have to make a choice." And in that moment, it seemed like in that case, maybe it was better for that family or that father to let the child die rather than his mother die. And it's a very difficult choice, of course, we all know that has to make. So there are implications for the family, because the family is also a user, both in a positive and negative kind of manner. And then, of course, there is the non-user eventually, the little child or the little family that does not get the possible solution and treatment and may eventually die. So what happens is that you have a child who has a multiple set of identities as a non-user. And as I was speaking earlier, and how it influences the person who provides the technological or the medical solution, you see that because the child has a particular social context and a social construct within which he or she is located, it influences the identities of the producer, in this case, the producer of technology or the producer of a solution or a cure, because the clinician becomes a clinician scientist when he enters a particular institution that demands scientific research. And when the child enters with its social context, they have to become a social activist. So the aggregate of non-users actually ends up producing an aggregate of producers, where the identity might vary from moment to moment. At one moment, the person who does the research and the innovation might be a scientist. At another moment, he might be a clinician. And at the third moment, he or she might actually have to become a social activist. So there is this very interesting dynamic that's playing around inside the laboratory, because the outside of the laboratory, the social context, the cultural context, where children in some cases, where parents in some cases will not allow for the eyes to be removed, not just because it's a girl child who won't get married, but because it's a cultural problem. They can't have eyes removed. It does not, their culture and their practices don't allow that. And this has an influence on the scientific enterprise. And the larger argument would be, an interesting thing would be to see how this pans out across different spaces, across different laboratories, across different disciplines, because all laboratories and all scientific institutions are located, of course, within the context of where they are. So, going forward from a very interventionist kind of perspective or a very development perspective, one might ask a question of the nature of the problem. And one sees in this case, and perhaps by extension to others, and ask the question whether it's a social problem or it's a technical problem or it's a medical problem. Because, if one was to argue that we had a great solution, but if the child does not come to the clinic because of the social context, then there is no solution. On the other hand, if you have a situation where societies change and the girl child is given as much value and respect as everybody else, and the child wants to come to the clinic, but we didn't have a medical or a technical solution, it still does not solve the problem of the child who has a tumor in the eye and that could cause her to die. So obviously it's not an either or case. It has to be both. And it is something at the intersection of two or maybe three different axes that bring these things together. And as we all know, if understanding of the problem it is that will actually decide the contours of the solution. And getting into the laboratory and understanding what is happening there in the way that I have tried to present, I think allows us for very interesting insights and possibilities in what's happening there and what might be implications depending on what the nature of the research problem that is. So in the case of the instrument making, we can agree that it is far away from any social context. It's pretty remote from realities of society in one kind of way. Whereas the last issue is certainly one where it's very, very central to what the problem is actually being solved. This is another presentation I made sometime back at the archives at the NCBS, where you can check this YouTube link for a talk on one of these case studies. And I will finish by thanking you very much. And this is my email ID. The books are available on Amazon and otherwise. And I'd be very happy to hear back from you if you have any comments, thoughts, suggestions, and things like that. Thank you very much. And thanks again for listening in, and to the India International Center for giving me this opportunity. Bye-bye.